People from all over the world came to New Orleans. Pirates, adventurers, gamblers, exiles, criminals, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Germans, Englishmen, Irishmen, Indians, Chinese, Italians, West Indians, Africans. In the hundreds of tenements in the rear of the Front Street buildings, there were people of all nationalities living side by side. And there was a whole lot of integrating going on. Danny Barker.
Jazz grew up in 1,000 places, but it was born in New Orleans, which was in the early 1800s, the most cosmopolitan and the most musical city in America. But New Orleans was also a major center of the slave trade, still tolerated in a country that had just proclaimed that all men were created equal. And the descendants of the human beings who were its living currency would eventually create the most American of art forms, jazz.
Captain said, hurry, hurry along.
The whole conception of improvisation is a part of all of American life. If you were a slave, you had to learn how to improvise. You came on the land, you couldn't speak the language. You had all kind of foods and stuff you weren't used to eat. You have another whole system to deal with. If you can't improvise, you're going to be in a world of trouble. You're not going to be able to survive.
Jazz is about freedom. It's about a certain kind of liberation. There have been other people, of course, have been oppressed in the United States or gone through brutal treatment in the United States. But only African Americans were enslaved. Only African Americans were legally a people who have a legacy and history, historical consciousness of having been unfree in a free country.
Beginning in 1817, slaves in New Orleans were permitted to sing and dance every Sunday afternoon in a place called Congo Square. To the curious whites, who sometimes turned out to see and hear them, the slaves' music, filled with complex percussive rhythms, seemed to provide an authentic glimpse of Africa. But most of the slaves in Congo Square had never seen Africa. Many were recent arrivals from the West Indies, their music filled with the infectious pulse of the Caribbean. Other slaves had been brought to the city from the interior of the American South, bringing with them work songs, spirituals, and the call and response of the Baptist Church. That's the sign of the judgment. That's the sign of the judgment. This sign of the judgment. New Orleans was also home to a unique and prosperous community of free people who called themselves Creoles of color. Many were the light-skinned descendants of French and Spanish colonists and their black wives and mistresses. They identified with their European, not their African ancestors, and they looked down on the darker-skinned blacks around them. Some owned slaves. Many Creole musicians were classically trained and prided themselves on being able to play music for every kind of dancing. There is a mania in this city, the New Orleans Picayune reported in 1838, for horn and trumpet playing. Citizens of every color and nationality marched to the music of brass bands. City streets were filled with parades of every kind, weddings, funerals, feast days, and the 6 to 8 week carnival season that each spring led up to Mardi Gras. In the decades before the Civil War, New Orleans had 3 flourishing opera companies and 2 full-fledged symphony orchestras, 1 white and 1 Creole. There was so much music, so much dancing going on, that a northern visitor called New Orleans one vast waltzing and gallipating hall.
It's a romantic city. The vendors in the streets would sing arias. People are really integrated in the way that they live. One block, you have an Italian family, various types of Negroes, you have some Creoles, you have Germans, you have everybody all intermingled, and they can't escape each other. And also, you had a tradition of wildness in New Orleans, like gambling and people showing their behinds in different various ways. But you also had a lot of churches and religious fervor. You had voodoo. You have all of these things coming together now. And you have people who don't like each other, but they have to deal with each other because they're living together and they're sharing this culture. They're sharing all of this like gumbo. Everybody's going to eat some gumbo.
New Orleans theaters also featured minstrel music. So-called plantation songs, written by white and black songwriters, performed by whites blacked up as blacks, and sometimes in later years, by blacks blacked up as whites playing blacks. On the surface, minstrelsy seemed simply to reinforce ugly racial stereotypes.
Minstrelsy was the most popular form of American entertainment for about 80 years in the United States, beginning in the 1840s. It produced the first body of serious pop songs, Stephen Foster, James Bland, others, songs that we still, all of us to this day, know. It produced a national humor that we all know. Why did the chicken cross the road? Who is that woman I saw you with last night? Because you had minstrel troupes, very much codified, all doing the same kinds of songs, same kinds of humor, crisscrossing the whole country, not just into major cities, but to all kinds of towns, any place where there was a hall where they could perform, it was like early television. It was the first entertainment form that everybody in the United States knew. Everybody heard the same songs. Everybody heard the same jokes. This had never happened before, and it wouldn't really happen again until the movies.
Despite its overt racism, the minstrel show was a blend of lively music, knockabout comedy, and sophisticated elegance. A bizarre and complicated ritual in which blacks and whites alike would interpret and misinterpret each other for decades.
I think that there's something that was so resilient in the black people, and that everyone in America could recognize that resilience. And even though it was masquerading farce and comedy and dance and a form of music, and it seemed like it was uncomplimentary, actually, there was something centrally American about it. And that was the beginning of a long relationship between blacks and whites, and black entertainment and white appropriation of it. and this strange dance that we've been doing with each other since really the beginning of our relationship in America. It's too close, it's too deep a story. So you have to degrade the relationship. You have to do degrading things so that you can live with the tremendous affront to humanity that slavery was.
The first big minstrel hit was written down and performed by a white man known as Daddy Rice, who said he'd first heard it being sung by a black stable hand. Rice named the tune after the man, Jim Crow. On January 26, 1861, the state of Louisiana seceded from the Union. But just 15 months later, a federal fleet steamed up the Mississippi River and forced New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy, to surrender. Union occupation signaled a new birth of freedom for the city's black population and unleashed a burst of creative energy.
It's the fact of the abolition of slavery that made jazz music possible. It comes from a consciousness of those who are outside of something, but in the middle of it. These are people who are American in the realest sense, but they've been denied access to recognition as Americans. But that doesn't alter the fact that they are American, and the fact that they have access to all of the information that Americans have access to.
For 12 years after the Civil War, in the period known as Reconstruction, federal troops occupied the South, enforcing civil rights and overseeing America's first attempt at integration. But in 1877, in a corrupt backroom deal between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats, the troops were withdrawn and Reconstruction collapsed overnight. White rule was brutally reimposed. Sharecropping replaced slavery. The Ku Klux Klan was ascendant, and lynchings became routine. Every aspect of daily life for African Americans became segregated under a system that someone named for Daddy Rice's minstrel hit, Jim Crow. For a time, cosmopolitan New Orleans escaped the worst of it.
Suddenly, I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. Gustav Kohl.
In the 1890s, two new styles of music reached New Orleans. Two styles without which there could have been no jazz. The first, created by black piano players in the cities of the Midwest, was jaunty, propulsive, irresistible. It drew from everything that had gone before: African-American spirituals and minstrel songs, European folk melodies, and military marches, all set to fresh, insistent, syncopated rhythms. It was called ragtime, and it would be America's most popular music for the next quarter of a century. Spread first by itinerant musicians, and then by the sale of sheet music, it was instantly popular with young dancers all over the country, who loved it all the more because their parents did not.
Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can be treated successfully only like the dog with rabies, with a dose of lead. Whether it is simply a passing phase of our decadent art culture, or an infectious disease which has come to stay, like leprosy, time alone can tell. Edward Baxter Perry.